January 28, 1393, Paris, the royal residence of Hotel Saint Paul. Picture this, a medieval dance hall packed with drunk nobles, flickering torches, and 6 costumed figures shrieking through a performance dressed as wild men of the woods. Their costumes are linen soaked in pitch, covered in flax fibers to make them look hairy, highly flammable, like walking Molotov cocktails. Someone, of course, brings a torch too close. Within seconds, 5 of the dancers are human fireballs, screaming, running, dying. And one of those dancers, Charles VI, King of France, the man who believes he is made of glass, who refuses to let anyone touch him because he's terrified of shattering, who has iron rods sewn into his clothes so he won't accidentally break if he falls. This is the ball of the burning men, and it's not even the strangest thing he ever did. Buckle up, friends. We're about to meet the original glass cannon. Let's rewind, because before Charles became the mad, he was the beloved. France loved this kid, and why wouldn't they? Born December 3, 1368, Charles was the golden child of Charles V, known as the Wise, who had spent his reign kicking the English out of France and rebuilding the kingdom after decades of war. Charles the Wise was basically the medieval equivalent of a turnaround CEO. He stabilized the currency. He rebuilt the Louvre. He filled the royal library with thousands of manuscripts. France was on top of the world. Then, in 1380, the Wise dropped dead. Charles VI was 11 years old. 11, imagine handing the keys to the most powerful kingdom in Europe to a kid who still believes in the tooth fairy. The coronation at Reims was spectacular, crown, cloak, the whole medieval Kardashian wedding treatment, but behind the throne, his uncles. 4 of them, the Dukes of Burgundy, Berry, Anjou, and Bourbon. None of these men were interested in France's well-being. They were interested in France's money. Philip the Bold of Burgundy took charge of the Regency Council and immediately started treating the royal treasury like his personal expense account. Taxes skyrocketed. Corruption bloomed. By the time Charles turned 14, the age of majority, his uncles smiled and said, "No, son, you're not ready yet. Let us keep the piggy bank." For 4 more years, Charles was a king in title only. His uncles threw lavish feasts, drained the coffers, and made France poorer than a church mouse that just got evicted. Finally, in 1388, the 20-year-old Charles decided enough was enough. He dismissed his uncles and brought back the advisors from his father's administration. The chronicler Jean Froissart called these men the marmosets, and yes, that's an actual quote. Under their guidance, France started healing. Taxes were lowered. Justice was restored. The people who had watched their king grow from a boy into a handsome, athletic, generous young man began to call him le bien-aimé, the well-beloved. Then came 1392. The first attack happened on August 5, 1392. Charles was leading a military expedition through a forest near Le Mans. The summer heat was brutal, French August, no air conditioning, wearing full plate armor. The king was already on edge because an assassination attempt had supposedly been made on one of his officers. Then a page boy dropped a lance. The sound of metal hitting metal echoed through the forest. According to the chroniclers, Charles suddenly went rigid. He screamed. Then he drew his sword and started swinging. He killed one knight, then another, then a third. By the time his own men managed to wrestle him off his horse, Charles had butchered 5 members of his own entourage. He lay in a coma-like stupor for days, and when he finally woke up, he had no memory of the massacre. He didn't recognize his wife. He didn't recognize his children. He didn't recognize himself. Imagine being Queen Isabeau. 6 months earlier, you had the most eligible king in Europe. Now you're married to a man who looks at you like you're a stranger and mumbles about conspiracies. Historians still debate what caused Charles's condition. Some say it was porphyria. Others suggest schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or the onset of paranoid psychosis. The truth is, we'll never know. What we do know is that over the next 3 decades, Charles suffered roughly 44 documented episodes of madness. Each attack lasted between 3 and 9 months. Between them, he'd have periods of lucidity lasting 3 to 5 months, but those windows shrank over time. By the end, the glass was mostly cracked. And the symptoms, they're the kind of thing that would land you on a Reddit rabbit hole about medieval madness. At times, Charles would run screaming through the palace halls. He'd refuse to bathe for months. One chronicler reports that by November 1405, the king was covered in lice and infected sores and had to be forcibly bathed by his physicians. He'd forget who he was. He'd forget who everyone else was. He'd accuse his wife and children of being imposters. But the strangest symptom, the one that gives us the hook for this whole episode, arrived in full force around 1405. Charles developed what psychiatrists now call the glass delusion. Let me explain. The glass delusion is an extraordinarily specific psychiatric phenomenon where a person believes they are made of glass. Not metaphorically, actually, completely. The sufferer genuinely, deeply, and unshakably believes that their body, or parts of it, has turned into fragile, brittle, shatter-prone glass. Charles VI was probably the first recorded case of someone believing his entire body was made of glass, and he took precautions. He had iron rods sewn into his clothing. The future Pope Pius II wrote, he would not let himself be touched. He had iron rods put into his clothing and protected himself in all sorts of ways so that he might not fall and break. Here's where the dark comedy kicks in. Charles was reportedly terrified that his buttocks would shatter. He wrapped them in blankets, multiple blankets, thick, padded, protective layers of blankets around his royal behind. And then he'd give orders to his courtiers, who had to stand there with straight faces and pretend this was perfectly normal, not to come too close, lest they accidentally brush against him and cause him to crack. Read that again. The King of France, wrapped in blankets, protecting his glass buttocks. Imagine being a nobleman who fought in the 100 Years' War, who survived the Black Death, who watched the English burn your villages. And now you're being told to walk softly around your monarch because he's worried about shattering his ass. You cannot make this stuff up. The glass delusion wasn't unique to Charles. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, dozens of glass men appeared across Europe, mostly among scholars and aristocrats. Robert Burton mentions them in The Anatomy of Melancholy. Cervantes wrote a short story called The Glass Graduate about a man poisoned into the same delusion. But Charles was the most famous sufferer, a king convinced he was a chandelier. Which brings us back to January 28, 1393. The night everything went horribly, spectacularly wrong. By early 1393, Charles had been diagnosed as mentally unstable following his 1392 break. His wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, was desperately trying to keep him entertained and distracted. She believed that if the court was joyful enough, if the pleasures were lavish enough, maybe Charles would stay sane. So when one of her ladies-in-waiting, Catherine de Fasteverin, announced her third marriage, Isabeau decided to throw a party, a big one. The entertainment was a charivari, a traditional raucous folk performance, usually involving music, dancing, and theatrical chaos. 6 senior knights of the court would dress as wild men of the woods, hairy, terrifying, mythical creatures supposedly from the demon-haunted forests of medieval imagination. Costumes were made of linen soaked in pitch, then covered with flax fibers to make them look like matted fur. The dancers would wear these costumes and perform a wild, frenzied dance. The masks were full-face coverings, glued on so nobody could recognize the performers. It was supposed to be fun. It was supposed to be thrilling. One tiny problem: pitch is extremely flammable. The organizers knew this. They issued a strict, clear, unambiguous order: no candles, no torches, no open flames anywhere near the performance. They even assigned guards to enforce the rule. Enter Louis I, Duke of Orleans, Charles's younger brother, the court's resident party animal, a man described by contemporaries as debauched and reckless. Louis arrived late, he arrived drunk, and he arrived with his entire entourage carrying lighted torches. The guards saw him, they warned him. Louis laughed. What's the worst that could happen? The worst happened very quickly. One of the dancers brushed against Louis's torch. The pitch-soaked linen ignited instantly. Within seconds, the man was a human fireball, screaming and flailing. As he ran in circles, he set the other dancers on fire. The hall filled with the smell of burning flesh, charred flax, and panicked nobility. 4 knights burned to death on the spot. Their costumes melted into their skin. The chronicler, the monk of Saint Denis, described it as a horrifying spectacle and noted that the screams of the dying were so terrible that many guests fainted. 2 people survived the inferno. The first was the Duke of Orleans himself. He wasn't wearing the costume, obviously. He survived to feel guilty about it, or maybe he didn't, considering he'd just drunkenly murdered 4 people. The second survivor was King Charles VI, and here's where the story gets strange again. A young noblewoman, the Duchess of Berry, who was only 14 years old at the time, recognized the king beneath his burning costume. She threw her skirt over him, literally wrapped her dress around the flaming man to smother the fire. She saved his life. But Charles was already insane. The fire, the screaming, the dying, none of it seemed to register the way it should have. He simply kept dancing, at least until his sister-in-law tackled him. The remaining dancer, the 5th performer, managed to survive by throwing himself into a barrel of wine. Yes, you heard that correctly. One of the burning men dove headfirst into a vat of alcohol to extinguish himself. It worked. 4 men dead, the King of France nearly dead, Paris in an uproar. When news of the disaster spread, the people of Paris were furious. This wasn't just a party gone wrong. This was proof, irrefutable, flaming proof, that the court had become a decadent, immoral circus. They believed the king's life had been risked for a frivolous costume dance. Demands for justice echoed through the streets. The court's response: public penance. Charles and Louis were forced to go barefoot to a cathedral and beg forgiveness. Chroniclers noted that Louis was accused not just of negligence, but of attempted regicide and sorcery. The implication, maybe he set his brother on fire on purpose. Whether true or not, the Bal des Ardents, the ball of the burning men, became a symbol of everything wrong with Charles VI's reign. It was the moment France realized their king was no longer just eccentric. He was dangerous. The fire didn't kill Charles, but the madness that followed hollowed out France. Between episodes of sanity, Charles would hand over power to his uncles, his wife, or his brother Louis, but none of them could agree on anything, and as the king's mind crumbled, so did the kingdom. In 1407, the situation finally exploded. Louis of Orleans, the same man who'd started the fire at the ball, was assassinated on the orders of John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. Philip the Bold was dead by then. His son John was even more ruthless. The murder plunged France into a brutal civil war between the Armagnacs, supporters of Orleans, and the Burgundians. 28 years, 2 decades and change of French nobles slaughtering each other, while the English watched from across the Channel and sharpened their swords. Charles drifted in and out of sanity throughout the entire conflict. When he was lucid, he'd try to negotiate peace. When he wasn't, he'd accuse his wife of adultery or refuse to wash for months on end. His relationship with Isabeau deteriorated badly. She became regent out of necessity, not love. The chroniclers turned on her, calling her the scorn of contemporary writers and spreading rumors about her sexual misconduct. Then, in 1415, disaster. Henry V of England invaded France. He brought longbows, ruthless tactics, and a burning ambition to claim the French crown. At the Battle of Agincourt, the English obliterated the French army. Thousands of French nobles died in the mud. Charles was too insane to even be present. By 1420, France was broken. The Burgundians had allied with the English. Isabeau, desperate to save whatever she could, signed the Treaty of Troyes. Its terms were brutal. Henry V would marry Charles's daughter, Catherine of Valois. Henry would become regent of France. And after Charles died, the French crown would pass to Henry's heirs, not to Charles's own son, the Dauphin. Charles VI signed the treaty, effectively disinheriting his own child. Did he understand what he was doing? The records don't say. By 1420, the King of France had spent nearly 3 decades in and out of psychosis. His signature on the document probably meant less than the pen that wrote it. 2 years later, on October 21, 1422, Charles VI died at the Hotel Saint Paul, the same palace where he'd almost burned to death 30 years earlier. He was 53 years old. He had been king for 42 years, longer than almost any other Valois monarch. But for half that time, he'd been a ghost in his own throne. Here's the twist. Charles VI died in 1422. Henry V of England had died just 2 months earlier. Suddenly, the Treaty of Troyes was in chaos. The Dauphin, the son Charles had disinherited, declared himself King Charles VII of France. With the help of a teenage peasant girl named Joan of Arc, he went on to drive the English out of France for good. Charles VI's legacy, in other words, is a coin with 2 very different sides. On one side, the man who plunged France into civil war, who lost Normandy and Aquitaine, who signed away his own son's inheritance. On the other side, the man whose death inadvertently created the conditions for France's ultimate victory. But that's not the part we remember, is it? We remember the glass. We remember the iron rods. We remember the King of France wrapping his backside in blankets and begging his courtiers not to jostle him. We remember the Ball of the Burning Men, 4 dead knights, a drunken duke with a torch, and a king who danced through the flames. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Charles VI wasn't a monster. He wasn't cruel like Caligula or paranoid like Tiberius. He was sick, genuinely, medically, horrifyingly sick. Medieval medicine had no idea what to do with him. They tried bleeding. They tried prayers. They tried locking him in rooms and hoping the melancholy would pass. It never did. So what's the lesson? Power doesn't always corrupt. Sometimes power just continues while the person holding it falls apart. France kept functioning because it had to. The machinery of state kept grinding even when the king was screaming at imaginary demons. And when Charles died, the country barely noticed. He ruled for 42 years, but he was only king for about half of them. The rest of the time, he was just a man. A frightened, delusional, broken man wrapped in blankets, terrified of shattering like a windowpane. And that, friends, is the real tragedy of the Glass King. So here's your takeaway. Absolute power is terrifying, but absolute power in the hands of a man who thinks his butt is made of glass, that's not terrifying, that's just sad. Charles VI wasn't a villain, he was a victim of genetics, a victim of medieval medicine, a victim of a system that had no off switch for a broken monarch. He died believing he would shatter if anyone touched him. He left behind a country at war with itself, a wife who hated him, a son he'd betrayed, and a legend so strange that people still tell it 6 centuries later. Wrap yourself in blankets if you want, but don't become king. And for the love of God, if you ever find yourself at a masquerade, check the flammability rating. See you next time. We're going back to Rome. Someone's got a crown to steal.